Hi folks, so there is one more data type that we're going to talk about today, and this is a special data type we call a Boolean. It's actually considered a basic data type, and basically a Boolean is just something that can either be true or false, right? When we need to say whether something exists or doesn't, we want to know if a certain criteria has been met, we're going to use this data type. So I'm just going to go ahead here and say some Boolean equals true, okay? I'm not going to go through the intermediate step. I think you guys get that right now. And again, what we're seeing here is we're seeing this visual cue. So when I use the word true, not in quotation marks, that has a very special meaning to the computer. And it means just that. It means true. The way that I can that means that when I want to test if something exists, for example, or I want to see, as I said, that a certain condition has been met, we'll see this later, that we're going to use a Boolean. And generally, we don't even assign Booleans to a variable. We actually just use them as a comparator, right? So we use this special value of true as a comparator, and we could also use false for that. So we're not going to get anything particularly exciting when we console log this. We're just going to get text that looks like that. But there we are. We see we've got this sort of true-false thing. And when we want to compare two things, for example, we use a different construct that we'll test out a little bit later. Now, the last thing I want to point out is what happens when we try to use a variable that doesn't exist. So you may have noticed at this point, right, that we have these sort of special reserved things going on. So we've got this sort of yellow number that we're using that comes up for log and var. Again, this means that these are sort of special mechanisms that the computer recognizes. We call these reserved words sometimes. It means that you don't want to create a variable called var because the computer will get confused, right? It won't know what you're talking about. Meanwhile, when we create our own variable name, we see this in white text. And so white text typically refers to a variable when we're working in script, right? This can be a little confusing, and we have our script all muddled up in our, sort of living in our HTML file. And we're very quickly going to move away from that. We're going to start working in separate JavaScript files. We have this gray text here that lets us describe what's happening in our code using regular English, because that double / is going to tell the computer to ignore what's happening there. We have our green text that comes up when we've created a text, or a string or a quoted item. Same thing we see in our object here. We've got these curly braces that say, hey, what's coming up as an object? And that object is really a list of what we call keys and values. And those things, the key is going to be in quotation marks, and then we use a colon to assign it a value, the same way that with a regular variable we use an equal sign. Whether that variable is an array or a string or a number, we use that equal sign. Again, in our array, we're going to let the computer know that what's coming up is an array by surrounding it in square brackets. And when we go back to our objects, we can see that if we want to get a particular part of an object, we can use this dot syntax. And we notice again that when we say the name of our variable and then the name of the key whose value we want to find, we don't put that in quotes. It's considered a property, sort of a subset of what's in some object, and so we use a dot for that. And again, our Boolean is going to be highlighted in red, just as our numbers are. All of this will become more familiar to you, but it's just to kind of highlight some of these features that are happening. So the last thing I want to do is see what happens when I try to console log some. So I'm going to try and console log something that I haven't declared yet. I'm going to try and console log some object way up here. Okay. And I just want to point out for you guys what happens when you do this. So let's say I've written something, and a lot of times it's actually really simple. In fact, I'm not even going to do that. I'm going to try to do, okay, I've done console log. Now, you may have noticed that I have a little typo here. I wrote same array instead of some array. Okay, so this is just a flag for you guys what happens when the names of your variables, the names that you're using in your code, don't quite match. Okay, so I'm going to save this, and when I come back to my console log and reload it, okay, this looks like trouble, right? Statement goes out fine, undefined, we had that for a while, and now it says uncaught reference error, same array is not defined. So this is an interesting difference, because what we can see is that in the first case, where we have told the computer to set aside some memory, right? Where did we do that? Sorry, we've told the computer to set aside some memory here. Hey, create a box, that's the var, label it some number, but we haven't put anything in that. It says, oh, well, I don't know what's in there yet, so I'm going to tell you it's undefined. That's different from accidentally referencing a variable, right? Trying to figure out the value, ask the computer what the value is of something that you haven't told it to set aside memory for. I haven't said var same array at any point here, and that's going to cause an error. So there's a difference between something not yet having a value and not having set aside the box with that label, given a box in memory, the particular label that you're referring to. So this is not something to freak out about. Again, I'm just going to point out that console log is really handy here because it tells us exactly where that problem happened, right? It happened on line 17. And if I flip back to my code, oh, yep, there it is. It turns out I had a typo there. The other thing that I want to point out for you guys is that when I had that typo there, everything stops, right? I had a whole bunch of console log statements that came after this. But when JavaScript runs into this kind of problem, it just goes, oof, I have no idea what you're talking about. I'm going home, right? I'm not going to even try anymore. And so very often, that's why using console log is so important, because it lets us check along the way and make sure that things are going okay. So if I correct this, some array should come up, and we'll see that we get on to the end of our print statements. So that's some basic introductions to data types, and also how we can use the console log statement as a way to keep track of what's happening in our program. So in our next iterations, we're going to look a little bit more at how we actually write some JavaScript to do things that we think are useful. But these are our building blocks, and I think you guys can see that there's really not a whole lot of them. We have numbers, strings, arrays, objects, Booleans, and that's it. That defines the main, the main parts of language that we will be concerned with in constructing our programs. Later on we'll talk about functions and how those relate. Those are our verbs, if you will, and we can kind of make those verbs do whatever we want, and they're going to be another really core element of programming. So if there are any questions, feel free to post them, and in the meantime, I hope you guys have a great week.